The island of Crete lay bathed in golden sunlight, its hills rising gently above the deep blue waters of the Aegean Sea. The scent of olive trees and salt hung in the air as waves lapped softly against the shore. At the heart of this land stood the great palace of Knossos, its towering pillars painted in red and gold, its courtyards filled with the murmur of servants, merchants, and guards. It was a place of grandeur, where King Minos ruled with pride, his throne seated upon centuries of wealth and power. But beneath the beauty of the palace, hidden deep within the earth, lay a secret, a maze of endless corridors, twisting tunnels, and walls so high they swallowed the light. This was the Labyrinth, a prison of stone built by the great inventor Daedalus, and within it roamed a creature unlike any other, a being of both man and beast, the Minotaur, its monstrous form cast in shadow, its deep, echoing breaths the only sign of its presence. Few knew the true origins of the labyrinth, but whispers spread across Greece. Some said it was a divine punishment, a curse placed upon Minos for defying the gods. Others spoke of a terrible secret, of a beast born from a union that should never have been. But one truth was known to all. The Minotaur was a creature of hunger and rage, and no one who entered its prison ever returned. Every year, as part of an uneasy truce, the city of Athens was forced to send a terrible tribute. 7 young men and 7 young women, chosen by lot to be sent to Crete as sacrifices. One by one, they would be cast into the labyrinth, left to wander its endless halls until the beast found them. It was a price paid for peace, a debt that King Minos demanded without mercy. And so, year after year, Athens mourned as its children sailed across the sea, never to be seen again. But this year would be different. This year, among those chosen, stood Theseus, Prince of Athens, a young warrior of strength and unshakable will. Unlike those before him, he did not sail to Crete with fear in his heart. He went with a mission, a vow whispered to the gods beneath the moonlit sky. I will enter the labyrinth, and I will slay the Minotaur. With the fate of Athens resting upon his shoulders, Theseus embarked on a journey that would take him into the depths of the unknown, into the twisting, silent halls of the labyrinth, where light was swallowed whole, and only the golden thread of Ariadne could guide him home. The journey had begun. Chapter 1. The Journey to Crete. The Athenian harbor was heavy with the scent of salt and burning torches as the chosen 14 boarded the ship bound for Crete. The waves lapped gently against the wooden hull, but for those standing on the deck, the journey ahead was anything but gentle. Parents and loved ones stood on the shore, their faces etched with sorrow, watching their sons and daughters depart for what had always been a one-way voyage. Among them stood Theseus, the Prince of Athens, clad in a simple tunic, his dark hair tousled by the sea breeze. Unlike the others, who clung to each other in hushed fear, he stood tall, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His father, King Aegeus, had begged him not to go, but Theseus had made a vow. He would put an end to the sacrifices, to the terror that had plagued Athens for too long. As the ship pulled away, the towering cliffs of Athens faded into the distance, swallowed by the vastness of the Aegean. The journey to Crete was long, days spent watching the waters stretch endlessly beneath the sky. At night, Theseus lay awake on the deck, staring at the stars, his mind filled with thoughts of the labyrinth, the Minotaur, and the unknown waiting for him beneath the palace of King Minos. The crew spoke in hushed voices, telling stories of the great maze, of the bones that littered its floors, of the cries that echoed from its depths. They whispered of the Minotaur, a creature neither fully man nor fully beast, its body massive, its horns curved like a bull's, its eyes filled with hunger. It did not kill out of malice, they said, but out of instinct. The labyrinth was its domain, and once inside, there was no way out. But Theseus did not fear the stories. As the sun dipped below the waves on the third day, the island of Crete finally emerged on the horizon, its shores lined with white stone buildings and rolling hills. And at its heart, rising above the city like a golden jewel, was the palace of Knossos, its towering columns glowing red in the dying light, its courtyards filled with the music of a kingdom that had long thrived on the suffering of others. The ship docked, and armed guards were already waiting. They led the Athenian captives through the streets, past merchants and citizens who barely spared them a glance. For Crete, this was routine. Another year, another offering to the beast in the depths. At last they arrived at the throne room, where King Minos sat upon a gilded seat, flanked by guards and draped in the finest silks. His eyes lingered on Theseus longer than the others, sensing something different about him, a defiance where there should have been fear. "Prince of Athens," Minos said, his voice deep and commanding, "do you know the fate that awaits you?" "I do," Theseus replied, his voice steady, "and I intend to change it." A murmur spread through the court, but Minos only smirked. He had heard brave words before, seen warriors enter the labyrinth thinking they could slay the beast, only for their screams to be swallowed by the stone corridors. "You will see the labyrinth at dawn," Minos said, waving his hand dismissively. The guards took the Athenians away, locking them in a chamber where they would await their fate. But Theseus was not alone. That night, as the torches burned low, a shadow moved silently into the chamber. Ariadne, daughter of Minos, stepped into the moonlight, her dark eyes searching Theseus's face. "I have seen many Athenians come here," she whispered, "but none like you." "I do not intend to die in the labyrinth," Theseus replied. Ariadne hesitated before stepping closer. "Then I will help you." She held out a small ball of golden thread, a lifeline, a secret that could lead him back from the depths of the labyrinth. "Take this," she said. "Tie it to the entrance and unravel it as you go. If you survive, it will be your only way out." Theseus took the thread and held it carefully, realization dawning in his mind. The gods had sent him a guide. The Minotaur awaited, but now, for the first time in generations, the odds had changed. The labyrinth would not be his grave. It would be his battleground. As dawn approached, the great stone doors to the labyrinth creaked open, the darkness beyond waiting to swallow him whole. And Theseus stepped forward. Chapter 2. The Maze of No Return. The great stone doors of the labyrinth groaned as they were pulled open, revealing a dark and yawning passage beyond. The air that rushed out was cool and stale, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something else, something ancient. The guards shoved Theseus forward, and as the last of the Athenian captives disappeared inside, the doors slammed shut behind them with a thunderous boom. Silence followed. Theseus stood at the entrance, his fingers tightening around the golden thread that Ariadne had given him. He had tied one end securely to the heavy iron ring on the wall behind him. The rest of the string lay coiled in his palm, his only chance of finding his way back. The air in the labyrinth was thick with stillness, broken only by the soft echoes of their footsteps against the cold stone floor. The others huddled behind him, fear weighing heavy in their breaths. The labyrinth was a living thing. The walls loomed high and seemed to stretch forever, the corridors twisting in unnatural directions, some sloping downward into unknown depths, others splitting into passages so narrow that only a single person could pass through at a time. The flickering torches that lined the walls did little to push back the shadows, leaving pockets of darkness that seemed to move with each breath. Theseus stepped forward cautiously, his heartbeat steady, his senses alert. "This way," he murmured, leading the others deeper into the maze. The labyrinth's traps. The deeper they ventured, the more the labyrinth changed. It was not just a maze of stone. It was alive, shifting, breathing, as if guiding them further into its depths. Corridors that had once been open were now sealed by towering walls. Passages that seemed safe led them in endless circles, bringing them back to where they had started. "Theseus," one of the Athenians whispered, fear creeping into his voice. "We've been here before." The prince studied the walls, running his fingers over the cool stone, tracing the carvings that had been left behind by those who had come before them. Scratched into the walls were names, messages, desperate pleas that faded into silence. No way out. The beast is always watching. If you hear it breathe, run. A gust of wind moved through the corridor, but there was no wind in the labyrinth. A sudden sound rumbled through the stone, deep and distant, a low exhalation of air, as if something massive had just stirred from sleep. The Minotaur had awoken. The first sign of the beast. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting with a life of their own. Theseus motioned for the others to stay close. Then, from somewhere deep within the maze, a sound echoed. A deep, guttural growl followed by the slow, measured clatter of hooves on stone. It was moving. Each step was deliberate, heavy, sending vibrations through the walls. Theseus strained his ears, trying to count the distance, to sense the direction. The Minotaur was not far, but the labyrinth distorted sound, making it impossible to know exactly where it was coming from. "We must keep moving," Theseus whispered, his grip tightening around his sword. The others followed, moving silently, their footsteps barely making a sound. The corridor ahead split into two paths, one narrow and twisting, the other wide and eerily open. And then, a sound from behind. A breath. Low, deep, close. The air shifted. The torches flickered. Something massive was there. Watching. Waiting. A shadow fell across the stone. And then, the Minotaur roared. Chapter 3. The Minotaur Awakens. The roar shook the labyrinth like a rolling thunderstorm trapped underground. Dust and loose pebbles tumbled from the ceiling as the deep, guttural sound of the Minotaur's rage echoed through the twisting corridors. The walls swallowed the sound, amplifying it, making it impossible to tell where the beast was, or how close it had come. Then came the footsteps, heavy, measured, unstoppable. The deep clatter of hooves on stone sent a chill down the spine of every Athenian in the group. It was slow at first, deliberate, as if the Minotaur was searching, listening. Then, suddenly, the steps quickened, turning into a thundering charge. It was coming. "Theseus!" one of the captives gasped. "Run!" Theseus ordered. The group bolted, fear overtaking them as they fled blindly down the twisting passageways. The golden thread in Theseus's hand unraveled quickly, stretching back toward the entrance, but there was no time to think about escape, only survival. The sound of the Minotaur's breath was closer now, a deep, snarling exhale, full of raw power. Then, the crash. The beast slammed into the stone wall behind them, the impact so great that it split the rock, sending cracks racing through the maze. The labyrinth trembled, as if it too were alive, responding to the Minotaur's fury. "Theseus!" one of the captives cried. The prince turned, sword in hand, his muscles tensed. The corridor ahead twisted into darkness, but the choice was clear. Face the beast or keep running deeper into the unknown. Theseus stopped running. He would not be a sacrifice. He would not die in the dark. He turned, planting his feet firmly against the stone, ready to face the monster that had haunted Athens for generations. The Minotaur's arrival. The torchlight flickered, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. Then, a shape emerged. The Minotaur. It was larger than any man, its body rippling with muscle, its bull-like head crowned with massive, curved horns that gleamed in the dim light. Its eyes burned red, filled with rage and hunger. It exhaled heavily, the force of its breath stirring the dust on the ground. Its hooves scraped the stone, testing its prey. Then it charged. The labyrinth shook beneath its power. Theseus dodged at the last moment, rolling to the side as the beast slammed into the wall with a deafening crash. Stone shattered, sending dust and debris into the air. The Minotaur roared again, turning wildly, its movements fast despite its size. Theseus gripped his sword tightly, keeping his stance firm. This would not be a battle of strength alone. He had to be faster, smarter. The Minotaur was a creature of instinct, driven by rage, by hunger. But Theseus had purpose. The beast charged again. This time, Theseus did not move immediately. He waited, watching, and then at the last second, he sidestepped, bringing his sword down in a sharp arc, slicing across the Minotaur's thick hide. A deep bellow of pain echoed through the labyrinth. The beast staggered, but it did not fall. Instead, it turned, its rage now entirely focused on Theseus. The prince took a breath, feeling the pulse of battle in his veins. He had wounded the Minotaur, but one wound would not be enough. This fight was far from over. This was only the beginning. Chapter 4. The Battle in the Dark. The Minotaur's roar filled the labyrinth, shaking the walls, sending a shiver through the air. Dust and loose stones trembled beneath its rage. Theseus stood firm, gripping his sword tightly, as the beast turned toward him once more, its nostrils flaring, its red eyes burning with fury. The first strike had wounded it, but not enough. The beast snorted, its massive chest rising and falling, the wound on its side oozing dark blood. But it did not retreat. It lowered its head, hooves grinding against the stone, preparing for another charge. Theseus exhaled slowly, steadying his breath. He knew the Minotaur was stronger, its raw power unmatched. But power alone was not enough to win a fight. He had to be faster, smarter. The labyrinth's walls stretched around them, narrow and twisting. He could use this. The Minotaur strikes. With a thunderous bellow, the Minotaur charged. The force of its hooves shook the ground, its horns gleaming in the flickering torchlight. Theseus waited until the last moment, then twisted to the side, narrowly dodging as the beast slammed headfirst into the stone wall behind him. The impact sent cracks racing through the labyrinth's ancient walls. A shower of dust and debris fell from above, and for a moment the Minotaur was stunned, shaking its massive head, dazed from the force of the blow. Theseus seized his chance. He rushed forward, sword raised, slashing across the beast's back, cutting deep into its thick hide. The Minotaur roared in pain, staggering forward, but still it did not fall. It turned wildly, swiping with its clawed hands, forcing Theseus to leap back. Blood dripped onto the stone floor, pooling at the Minotaur's hooves. It was injured, but its rage only grew. The beast's breath came in heavy, labored exhales, its muscles tensing once more. It had been caught off guard, but now it would not make the same mistake. Theseus saw it in its eyes. This time, the Minotaur would not charge blindly. This time, it would hunt him down step by step. The deadly dance. The beast lunged, swinging one massive arm toward Theseus. He barely dodged, feeling the rush of air as the force of the strike slammed into the stone behind him, cracking the wall. Theseus rolled to the side, his sword slicing out once more, but the Minotaur was ready. With unnatural speed, it blocked the blow, gripping the blade in its massive hand. For a heartbeat, the two were locked in place. Warrior and beast, strength against strategy. Then, with a feral snarl, the Minotaur ripped the sword from Theseus's grasp and hurled it across the chamber. The weapon clattered against the stone floor, skidding out of reach. For the first time, Theseus felt vulnerable, unarmed. The Minotaur towered over him, its chest rising and falling, its wounds dripping blood, but its rage undiminished. Then it charged again. Theseus had no time to think. He turned and ran, darting down one of the twisting corridors, the Minotaur thundering after him. The passage was narrow, forcing the beast to move slower, its great horns nearly scraping the stone walls. Theseus took every turn without hesitation, leading it deeper into the maze, through winding passages that looped endlessly, using the labyrinth itself against it. But he could not run forever. His chest burned with every breath, his heart pounding in his ears. He needed his sword. He needed a way to end this fight, before the labyrinth claimed him like so many before. The Minotaur was closing in, and Theseus was running out of time. Chapter 5. The Final Stand. Theseus sprinted through the twisting corridors of the labyrinth, the air thick with the scent of dust and blood. Behind him, the Minotaur gave chase, its hooves pounding against the stone, each step a deafening drumbeat of raw power. The torches lining the walls flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift with the movement of the maze itself. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body slick with sweat, but he could not stop. Not yet. Ahead, the corridor split, two paths, both unknown. For a brief moment, Theseus hesitated. Then, trusting his instincts, he turned left, feet skidding against the cold floor. The sound of shattering stone rang out as the Minotaur crashed through a wall behind him, refusing to lose sight of its prey. It bellowed in fury, its horns grazing the ceiling as it forced its massive form through the narrow passage. Theseus's sword was still out of reach, lost in the darkness of the labyrinth. He could not win without it. He had to get back to the place where it had fallen. He followed the golden thread, still trailing through the corridors like a lifeline. Each step drew him closer to where he had first engaged the beast. The Minotaur, sensing the chase was nearing its end, slowed its pursuit, its breath heavy, ragged. Theseus could hear it sniffing the air, its primal instincts sharpening as it prepared to corner him. And then he saw it. His sword gleaming faintly in the dim torchlight, lying near the shattered remains of a broken pillar. Theseus lunged forward, his fingers closing around the hilt just as the Minotaur roared and charged again. The beast came fast, unstoppable, its massive form bearing down upon him. But this time, Theseus did not run. The warrior and the beast. The moment slowed. Theseus stood firm, sword in hand, his breath steady. The Minotaur lowered its horns, its body coiled like a spring, ready to strike. A heartbeat passed. Then, with a thunderous roar, the beast lunged. Theseus dropped low, rolling beneath the Minotaur's massive form at the last possible second. The beast's momentum carried it forward, its horns goring the stone wall behind him. Dust exploded around them. The Minotaur stumbled, stunned for the briefest moment. It was all Theseus needed. With a swift, powerful motion, he rose to his feet, gripping his sword with both hands, and drove the blade deep into the Minotaur's chest. The beast let out a sound, not a roar, but a deep, painful exhale, its massive body shuddering as the sword pierced its heart. Its red eyes, once filled with rage, dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. It staggered, its powerful legs failing, and then the great Minotaur fell, its body hitting the ground with a heavy finality. Silence swallowed the labyrinth. For the first time in generations, the beast was dead. The way out. Theseus stood over the fallen creature, his chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. His grip on the sword loosened, his body aching from exhaustion, but he did not fall. The fight was over. But the labyrinth was still around him, its dark corridors stretching endlessly. And then he saw it, the golden thread, still trailing through the halls leading the way back. Ariadne's gift had not failed him. He followed it, step by step, through the winding paths, through the cold silence of the now empty maze. The torches flickered low, their light barely touching the walls, but he kept moving. Then, finally, a crack of light ahead. The labyrinth's entrance. With one last deep breath, Theseus stepped out of the darkness and into the dawn. Chapter 6. Escape from Crete. The first breath of fresh air filled Theseus's lungs as he stepped out of the labyrinth, the golden thread still clutched tightly in his fingers. The first rays of dawn cast a soft glow over the grand courtyard of Knossos, painting the stone walls in hues of orange and gold. The palace was eerily silent. No guards waited at the entrance, no cheering crowds, only the steady whisper of the wind and the distant murmur of the Aegean Sea. The other Athenians, the young men and women who had been sent as sacrifices, stood frozen at the sight of him, alive, victorious. The monster that had haunted Athens for generations was dead. And then Ariadne emerged from the shadows. Her dark eyes searched his face, her hands gripping the folds of her tunic. "You did it," she breathed. Theseus gave a single, firm nod. "It's over." She let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. But they were not safe yet. "We must leave," she whispered urgently, "before my father finds out what you've done." King Minos would not take the death of the Minotaur lightly. Theseus had not just escaped. He had shattered the legend of the Labyrinth, an act of defiance that would shake Crete to its core. If they were caught, there would be no mercy. Theseus turned to the other Athenians. "Gather what you can. We sail tonight." The Great Escape. The docks of Crete were empty, save for the gentle lapping of the waves against the wooden piers. The ship that had carried them from Athens was still there, its sails furled, its deck dark beneath the moonlight. Ariadne led them quickly through the winding streets, past the towering pillars of the palace, past the marketplaces that had once bustled with life. But now the city felt different, as if the very island knew something had changed. They moved swiftly, silently, every step a risk, every shadow a possible watchful eye. Then a shout in the distance. Torches flared to life in the palace above them. King Minos knew. The sound of rushing footsteps echoed from the upper streets as guards were roused from their sleep. The alarm had been raised. "Theseus," Ariadne whispered, her voice sharp with urgency. "We have to run." The Athenians broke into a sprint, their feet pounding against the stone streets, the distant shouts of soldiers growing closer. The docks were in sight now, the Athenian ship swaying gently in the tide. The first of the Athenians reached the ship and scrambled aboard, untying the ropes, unfurling the sails. Theseus turned back, hand outstretched for Ariadne, guiding her onto the ship's deck. Just as they leapt aboard, the first arrows sliced through the air, thudding into the wooden hull. Minos's guards had reached the docks, their torches casting an angry glow against the water. But it was too late. The ship caught the wind, its sails billowing as it pulled away from the harbor. The oars dipped into the water, the rhythmic sound of their strokes drowning out the distant cries of the Cretan king. They were free. A farewell under the stars. The Aegean stretched endlessly before them, the waters a shimmering silver under the moonlight. The towering cliffs of Crete faded into the distance, swallowed by the horizon. The Athenians cheered, their voices breaking into laughter and songs of victory. Theseus stood at the ship's bow, staring out at the dark waves, the wind cool against his skin. Ariadne approached quietly, standing beside him. "You saved them," she murmured. "You saved me," Theseus replied, turning toward her. "Without the golden thread, I never would have made it out." Ariadne smiled, but there was a sadness in her eyes. And now what? Theseus hesitated. He had sworn to free his people, to break the cycle of death that had plagued Athens, and he had done that. But fate was not finished with him yet. He glanced back at the receding shape of Crete, knowing that King Minos would never forgive this act of defiance. His revenge would come, one way or another. But for now, they were safe. For now, they had won. The ship cut through the dark waters, carrying them toward Athens, toward destiny, toward the unknown. But not all endings were happy ones, and not all debts had been paid in full. Chapter 7. The Price of Victory. The waters of the Aegean Sea stretched endlessly before them, shimmering under the first light of dawn. The ship sailed smoothly, cutting through the gentle waves, carrying Theseus and the freed Athenians homeward. For the first time in days, the air was calm. The distant shores of Crete were now barely a shadow on the horizon, and with them, the legend of the Minotaur was now just that, a story of the past. Theseus had fulfilled his vow. Athens would no longer send its children to die. And yet, beneath the victory, a quiet weight settled over the ship. At the stern, Ariadne stood alone, her gaze lost in the rolling sea. She had left everything behind, her home, her father's palace, her life in Crete, for Theseus. She had saved him. And now, as the waves stretched endlessly before them, she waited for him to speak. The island of Naxos, a parting under the moon. As night fell, a small island appeared in the distance, a lone, silent stretch of land surrounded by dark waters. Theseus stood at the helm, watching as the ship approached its shores. Naxos. The crew lowered the sails, guiding the ship into the quiet bay. The waves lapped gently against the shore, whispering secrets to the sands. Theseus led the Athenians off the ship, setting up camp for the night. Ariadne stayed at the water's edge, her fingers trailing through the cool surf, her heart heavy. "Theseus," she said softly, "what happens now?" For the first time since leaving Crete, Theseus did not answer immediately. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. "Athens needs me," he said at last. "And what of me?" Ariadne asked, her voice barely above a whisper. A pause. Then, slowly, Theseus looked away. Ariadne's heart sank. She understood before he even spoke. "This island is safe," he murmured, his voice strangely distant. "You will be protected here." She took a step toward him. "I did not leave Crete to be abandoned on some foreign shore." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crashing of the waves. And then, footsteps retreating. Ariadne turned sharply, but Theseus was already walking back to the ship, his shadow long beneath the moonlight. She ran forward, grasping his arm, her breath uneven. "You promised me, Theseus." Theseus did not meet her gaze. She had given him everything, her trust, her love, her golden thread to escape the labyrinth. And now he was leaving her behind. Ariadne's voice broke. "Why?" The Prince of Athens stood silent. Perhaps he feared bringing her to Athens, where she would be seen as a traitor. Perhaps he feared the wrath of King Minos, who would surely seek vengeance. Or perhaps he was simply a man who had used her when he needed her, and no longer did. No answer came. And with that, Theseus turned and stepped onto the ship, the gangplank rising behind him. Ariadne stood motionless on the shore, the cold waves brushing against her ankles as the ship drifted away. She watched until the sails disappeared into the night. And then, for the first time since escaping Crete, Ariadne was alone. The Curse of the Black Sails. The ship cut through the waves, Athens now on the horizon. The air was thick with salt, with tension, with unspoken regrets. Theseus stood at the bow, silent, his thoughts unreadable. He had slain the Minotaur. He had freed his people. He had left Ariadne behind. Victory should have felt lighter than this. The sea breeze ruffled the ship's sails, but Theseus did not look up, and so he did not see that the sails were still black. Before he had left, his father, King Aegeus, had given him a command. If you are victorious, return with white sails. If you fail, return with black. But Theseus had forgotten. A father's sorrow. Atop the cliffs of Athens, King Aegeus stood, watching the horizon. Every day since Theseus had departed, he had come to this place, waiting for his son's return. And today, he saw the ship. The black sails fluttered in the wind, the color of death. The king's heart shattered. His son was gone. Overcome with grief, he staggered backward, his vision blurred with sorrow. The weight of loss, of heartbreak, was too much to bear. And so, before anyone could stop him, King Aegeus stepped forward and fell from the cliffs into the sea below. The waters swallowed him whole. From that day forward, the sea would forever bear his name, the Aegean Sea. The price of victory. Theseus stepped onto the shores of Athens, his people cheering, their voices raised in triumph. But their faces changed when they saw his expression. His father, dead. Ariadne, left behind. The Minotaur was slain. The labyrinth was conquered. But victory had come at a cost. Theseus was a hero, but heroes, like kings, were not immune to the cruel hand of fate. And, as the sun set over Athens, he understood the truth. Not all victories were free. Some were paid in sorrow. Some were paid in loss. And some were paid in blood. Epilogue. The Threads of Fate. Far away on the island of Naxos, Ariadne stood beneath the moonlight, her heart heavy with betrayal. But she was not alone. A new voice called her name. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man wreathed in ivy, his eyes gleaming with the light of divine power. Dionysus, the god of wine and revelry. He smiled. You are not meant to be forgotten, Ariadne. The winds shifted, carrying her sorrow away. Her fate had not ended with Theseus. It was only beginning. The labyrinth was gone. The Minotaur was dead. But the story would live forever.